The records were meant to disappear. Every trace of what happened on Beacon Hill in the winter of 1860 was systematically destroyed, the testimonies burned, the witnesses relocated or silenced. The Ohio State Archives lists the incident as a settlement dispute resolved through relocation, but you're about to learn what they didn't want preserved. What they couldn't quite erase completely. The first snow fell on Beacon Hill on October 15, 1860, earlier than anyone in Meigs County had seen in decades. The small community of 43 souls, led by a charismatic preacher named Ezekiel Thorne, had established their settlement just 18 months prior on the remote Hilltop, drawn by Thorne's promises of spiritual purity and agricultural prosperity. They called it Haven's Rest. The irony would become apparent later. Thorne wasn't like other frontier preachers. Born in Massachusetts to a family of theologians, he possessed a doctorate in philosophy from Harvard and spoke 7 languages fluently. His sermons drew from Gnostic texts and ancient manuscripts that most rural Ohio settlers had never heard of. But it was his eyes that people remembered most. Deep-set and pale gray, they seemed to look through you rather than at you, as if you were seeing something others couldn't. The settlement's isolation wasn't accidental. Thorne had chosen the location specifically for its distance from established towns and trade routes. The nearest neighbor was 12 miles away through dense forest. No proper roads led to Haven's Rest, only a narrow trail that became impassable in heavy weather. When the early snow began to fall, that trail disappeared entirely. Sarah Whitmore kept a detailed journal throughout her time at Haven's Rest. She was 24, unmarried, and had followed Thorne from Boston after hearing him speak at a transcendentalist gathering. Her education was unusual for a frontier woman. She could read Latin and had studied anatomy under her physician father. This background would prove crucial to understanding what happened next. Her journal, discovered in 1923 hidden beneath the floorboards of a demolished farmhouse, provides the only first-hand account of the settlement's final months. Her entry for October 20th reads, "Brother Thorne has called for extended fasting and prayer as the snow continues. He says the early winter is a test of our faith. The children cry from hunger, but he insists we must purify ourselves through suffering. Mrs. Henderson's baby has grown weak. I fear for the little one." The settlement had been established with deliberate inadequacy. Thorne's emphasis on spiritual preparation over practical concerns wasn't accidental ignorance. It was calculated manipulation. He had studied previous frontier settlements that failed due to poor planning, and he deliberately recreated those conditions. The insufficient food stores, the lack of proper preservation methods, the absence of experienced hunters or farmers among his followers. All of these factors were carefully orchestrated to create the desperate circumstances that would make his theological proposals seem reasonable. Thorne's followers weren't random converts drawn by charismatic preaching. Each individual had been specifically selected based on psychological profiles he had developed during his years of studying human behavior at Harvard. He sought out people experiencing profound loss, social isolation, or existential crisis. He identified individuals with strong religious backgrounds who would be susceptible to theological arguments that challenged conventional morality. Most importantly, he recruited people with useful skills, medical knowledge, carpentry, food preparation, who could contribute to the community's survival while remaining dependent on his leadership. By November, the settlement was completely cut off. The early snow had become a relentless blizzard that lasted for weeks. Game disappeared from the forest. The community's food stores, already meager due to Thorne's emphasis on spiritual rather than practical preparation, began to run dangerously low. Families started rationing portions that were already insufficient for survival. But the isolation served another purpose beyond creating dependency. Thorne needed time to gradually shift his followers' psychological state from conventional morality to acceptance of practices that would have horrified them under normal circumstances. The physical stress of hunger and cold made his followers more susceptible to suggestion and less capable of rational analysis of his theological arguments. This is where the official records begin to diverge from reality. According to the county sheriff's report filed the following spring, the settlement simply, quote, disbanded due to harsh weather conditions. The survivors, he claimed, had been evacuated by a rescue party in early December and relocated to various towns throughout Ohio and Pennsylvania. Clean. Simple. Unremarkable. But Sarah Whitmore's journal tells a different story entirely. Her November 15th entry describes the first death. Little Mary Henderson passed in the night. She was only 8 months old. Brother Thorne says her death is part of God's plan, but I cannot accept such cruelty from a loving Creator. Mrs. Henderson has not spoken since we wrapped the child in linen. The ground is frozen too hard for burial. Brother Thorne has ordered the body placed in the cold cellar until spring. The death of Mary Henderson wasn't unexpected. Thorne had been monitoring the child's declining health for weeks, and his private notes, discovered decades later, reveal that he had deliberately reduced the infant's food allocation to accelerate her demise. He needed a death to occur naturally to provide the initial justification for his consumption theology. The infant's death served as the catalyst for everything that followed. 3 more children died within the week. Then elderly Samuel Preston collapsed during morning prayers. The settlement's population began to dwindle, but the deaths brought an unexpected problem. With the ground frozen solid and no access to proper burial sites, the bodies had to be stored somewhere. Thorne ordered them placed in the settlement's communal cold cellar, claiming they would receive proper Christian burial come spring. The cold cellar had been specifically designed for this purpose. Thorne's architectural plans, preserved in his personal papers, show that the structure was much larger than necessary for food storage alone. The temperature control mechanisms were more sophisticated than typical root cellars, incorporating ventilation systems that would preserve human remains for extended periods. Most telling, the cellar included drainage systems and work surfaces that served no purpose for vegetable storage, but would be essential for butchering activities. Sarah's November 28th entry reveals the moment everything changed. Brother Thorne gave the strangest sermon today. He spoke of the ancient Israelites consuming the Passover lamb, of Christ commanding his disciples to eat his flesh and drink his blood. He said the boundary between the sacred and the physical is an illusion created by weak minds. Mrs. Caldwell asked what he meant. His response chilled me to the bone. The dead have no further use for their earthly vessels, but the living must survive to carry out God's work. The theological framework Thorne presented wasn't improvised desperation. It was the culmination of years of careful study and preparation. His Harvard education had provided access to rare religious texts and philosophical treatises that most people would never encounter. He had studied historical accounts of survival consumption, ritualistic consumption practices from various cultures, and theological justifications for breaking conventional moral taboos during times of crisis. The suggestion was subtle at first. Thorne never explicitly commanded the practice. Instead, he planted the idea through carefully crafted theological arguments, twisting biblical passages to support his position. He spoke of spiritual communion through physical consumption. He cited obscure Gnostic texts about transcending earthly taboos. He reminded the starving settlers that their survival was necessary to spread his teachings to the wider world. His method reveals sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation and social influence. Rather than issuing direct orders that might trigger resistance, he created an intellectual framework that allowed his followers to convince themselves that the practice was not only acceptable, but spiritually necessary. He presented the decision as their own choice based on their superior understanding of divine will, making them complicit in their own moral corruption. Thomas Brennan was the first to voice what others were thinking. A carpenter from Virginia, he had lost his wife to fever 3 weeks earlier. His journal entry, discovered years later in his son's possession, describes the moment of surrender. "I cannot watch my children starve when sustenance lies so near." Brother Thorne is right about the sanctity of survival. The dead feel nothing. The living must endure. Brennan's capitulation wasn't spontaneous. Thorne had been working on him specifically for weeks, exploiting his grief over his wife's death and his desperation to save his remaining children. Private conversations between Thorne and Brennan, recorded in Sarah Whitmore's journal, reveal a systematic campaign of emotional manipulation designed to break down his resistance to the consumption proposal. The first consumption occurred on December 3, 1860. Sarah Whitmore recorded every detail with clinical precision that suggests she was either in shock or had developed an emotional distance necessary for psychological survival. Her account is disturbing in its matter-of-fact tone. Brother Thorne led us in prayer before the meal. He had prepared the meat himself, claiming sacred knowledge of proper preparation rituals. The flesh was surprisingly tender, though it required extensive cooking to mask the unusual texture. Mrs. Brennan wept throughout the meal but consumed her portion nonetheless. The children ate without question, too young to understand the source of their sudden abundance. The preparation methods Thorne employed weren't improvised. His knowledge of butchering, preservation, and cooking techniques for human flesh suggests prior experience or extensive study. The tools he used were precisely suited for the task: surgical instruments rather than conventional kitchen knives, specialized cutting boards that would prevent contamination, and cooking vessels designed for maximum heat retention. Within days of the first consumption, strange changes began to manifest in the settlement. Sarah's journal entries describe phenomena that defy rational explanation. Settlers reported increased energy and mental clarity despite the harsh conditions. Several claimed enhanced night vision and improved resistance to cold. Most disturbing of all, they began experiencing what Thorne called communion visions, shared hallucinations, or dreams that connected them to their deceased neighbors. The physical changes weren't psychosomatic responses to suggestion. Sarah Whitmore's medical training allowed her to document objective physiological alterations that couldn't be explained by improved nutrition alone. Blood pressure readings showed unusual patterns. Pulse rates decreased significantly while physical endurance increased. Most concerning, several settlers displayed enhanced reflexes and coordination that exceeded normal human capabilities. Thorne interpreted these changes as divine confirmation of his teachings. He established elaborate rituals around each consumption, treating the dead as sacred offerings rather than desperate food sources. He assigned specific body parts to different settlers based on what he claimed were spiritual affinities. The heart went to leaders, the brain to scholars, the hands to craftsmen. Each consumption was preceded by hours of prayer and followed by detailed recordings of any resulting visions or physical changes. The journal entries from this period read more like medical case studies than personal reflections. Sarah Whitmore, drawing on her anatomical training, documented the physical transformations with scientific precision. Settlers' hair grew thicker and darker. Their teeth became sharper. Their fingernails hardened and lengthened. Most unnervingly, their body temperatures dropped several degrees, while their energy levels increased dramatically. The physiological changes occurred too rapidly and too consistently to be natural adaptations to diet or environment. Thorne's private notes reveal that he had been supplementing the consumed flesh with chemical compounds derived from plants he had collected during the settlement's early months. These additives weren't random folk remedies. They were sophisticated biochemical preparations based on formulas he had acquired from his international correspondence. Analysis of soil samples from the Haven's Rest site has revealed traces of alkaloids and psychoactive compounds that don't occur naturally in Ohio's ecosystem. Thorne had apparently cultivated exotic plants using seeds and cuttings, obtained through his academic connections. The garden plots around the settlement weren't for food production. They were pharmaceutical laboratories designed to produce consciousness-altering substances. By January, the practice had evolved into something far more structured and sinister. Thorne established what he called the Sacred Order of Necessary Consumption. Members took formal vows, pledging to continue the practice even after rescue arrived. They swore secrecy about their rituals and agreed to establish similar communities elsewhere. This wasn't temporary survival cannibalism. It was the foundation of a new religious movement. The transformation wasn't just physical. Survivors reported radical changes in personality and perception. Previously gentle individuals became aggressive and predatory. Settlers who had been close friends began viewing each other with calculating hunger. parents started looking at their own children differently. The community's social structure collapsed into a hierarchy based on who had consumed the most human flesh. Sarah Whitmore's January 20th entry reveals the full horror of what Haven's Rest had become. Brother Thorn announced that natural deaths are no longer sufficient to sustain our spiritual growth. He claims divine revelation has shown him that willing sacrifice produces more powerful transformations than mere consumption of disease-claimed bodies. James Morrison volunteered to be the first. His wife Sarah begged him to reconsider, but he insisted it was God's will. Brother Thorn performed what he called the sacred cutting at dawn. Morrison remained conscious until the end, chanting prayers as his blood drained into consecrated vessels. The transition from consuming natural deaths to orchestrated sacrifices marked the complete success of Thorn's psychological manipulation. His followers had progressed from reluctant survival cannibalism to enthusiastic ritual murder in less than 2 months. The speed of this transformation demonstrates the effectiveness of his combination of theological persuasion, biochemical manipulation, and social pressure. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't the voluntary nature of these sacrifices. It was how enthusiastically the community embraced them. Settlers competed for the honor of being chosen. Families offered their weakest members as candidates. Children asked when they would be old enough to volunteer. The line between religious devotion and madness had completely dissolved. Thorn claimed these transformations were evidence of human evolution guided by divine will. He preached that conventional humanity was merely a larval stage, and that his followers were becoming something higher through their sacred consumption. He called them the awakened, and promised they would inherit the earth once they had perfected their new nature. The winter deepened, but Haven's Rest no longer struggled with food shortages. Their population continued to decline through voluntary sacrifices, but the survivors grew stronger and more unified in their devotion to Thorn's teachings. They began planning for spring. Not rescue, but expansion. Thorn had identified locations for establishing similar communities throughout the Midwest. Each surviving settler was assigned a specific territory to evangelize once the snows melted. The expansion plans weren't vague religious aspirations. They were detailed strategic documents that outlined specific target populations, recruitment methods, and resource requirements for establishing new communities. Thorn had studied demographic patterns and identified regions experiencing social instability, economic hardship, or religious upheaval that would make populations vulnerable to his message. The scientific precision with which Thorn documented the physical and psychological changes suggests he possessed knowledge far beyond what any frontier preacher should have had. His detailed anatomical drawings, preserved in Sarah Whitmore's journal, demonstrate understanding of human physiology that wouldn't become common knowledge until decades later. His psychological observations about altered consciousness states and enhanced cognitive function anticipate discoveries in neuroscience that weren't made until the 20th century. Where did Thorn acquire this knowledge? The answer may lie in documents discovered in 1987 during the renovation of a Boston mansion once owned by Thorn's family. Hidden behind a false wall, investigators found a collection of journals, letters, and anatomical drawings dating back to the 1830s. These materials suggest that Ezekiel Thorn wasn't the originator of the sacred order of necessary consumption. He was continuing work begun by previous generations of his family. The documents reveal a network of wealthy New England families who had been experimenting with what they called physiological transcendence for decades. They sponsored expeditions to collect rare manuscripts from monasteries and temples worldwide. They funded medical research into the effects of various diets on human consciousness. Most disturbing, they maintained detailed records of experiments conducted on servants, slaves, and other vulnerable individuals who had no legal protection. Thorn's grandfather, Josiah Thorn, had apparently made contact with a Tibetan monastery whose monks practiced ritualistic consumption of human neural tissue as part of their meditation practices. The monks claimed this allowed them to absorb the memories and consciousness of their predecessors, creating an unbroken chain of accumulated knowledge spanning centuries. Josiah spent 3 years at the monastery before returning to Boston with detailed instructions for adapting their practices to Western physiology. Ezekiel Thorne inherited not just wealth and knowledge, but a multi-generational mission to perfect human evolution through controlled consumption. Haven's Rest wasn't a desperate survival situation that accidentally led to ritualistic practices. It was a carefully orchestrated field test of theories developed over decades of secret research. This context explains the sophisticated nature of Thorne's theological arguments and his precise knowledge of human physiology. It also explains why he chose such an isolated location for his community. Haven's Rest was designed to be a laboratory where he could test his family's theories on a controlled population without interference from authorities or rival researchers. The official rescue party arrived on March 8, 1861, led by Sheriff Marcus Webb and accompanied by a Methodist minister named Reverend Cornelius Flynn. They expected to find a community of starving, grateful survivors ready for evacuation. Instead, they discovered something that challenged their understanding of human nature. The settlement appeared prosperous and well organized. The surviving 21 residents were healthy, alert, and showed no signs of malnutrition or distress. They initially refused rescue, claiming they had achieved perfect spiritual communion with the divine and needed no outside assistance. When pressed about the missing settlers, they claimed those individuals had transcended physical existence through sacred sacrifice. Sheriff Webb's private report, sealed for 60 years and only made public in 1921, describes his growing horror as he investigated the settlement. The cold cellar contained carefully prepared human remains, arranged with ritualistic precision. The settlers' living quarters were decorated with bones, teeth, and other human remains fashioned into religious artifacts. Most disturbing, the survivors showed no shame or remorse about their actions. They attempted to convert the rescue party to their beliefs. Reverend Flynn's account provides additional disturbing details. He noted that the settlers spoke in perfect unison during certain conversations, as if sharing a collective consciousness. They demonstrated knowledge of events and information they couldn't possibly have acquired through normal means. Most unnervingly, they seemed to anticipate his thoughts and responses during theological discussions. The removal process itself revealed additional disturbing aspects of the settlers. Transformation. They demonstrated unusual physical strength and resistance to cold that allowed them to survive exposure that should have been fatal. Several rescue party members reported that the settlers seemed to anticipate their movements and coordinate responses without visible communication. Most unnervingly, they showed no fear of death or injury. They appeared genuinely convinced that physical existence was merely a temporary condition that could be transcended through proper spiritual practices. But the story doesn't end with the evacuation. The careful dispersal of survivors wasn't random humanitarian assistance. It was the next phase of the Thorne family's experimental program. The official records show the survivors being distributed to various towns throughout Ohio and Pennsylvania, but tracking their subsequent activities reveals a disturbing pattern. Within 5 years, each location where a Haven's Rest survivor settled experienced mysterious disappearances, unexplained deaths, and reports of strange religious gatherings in remote areas. Thomas Brennan relocated to a small farming community outside Pittsburgh. Within 18 months, 7 residents had vanished without trace. Local newspapers reported the formation of an unusual religious sect that practiced extreme fasting and held secret nighttime gatherings in the woods. Brennan died in 1867 under suspicious circumstances. His body was discovered completely drained of a red liquid with surgical precision cuts that suggested expert anatomical knowledge. But Brennan's death wasn't the end of his influence. His 3 children, who had been too young to fully understand the practices at Haven's Rest, began experiencing what they described as inherited memories. As they reached adolescence, they reported detailed recollections of events they had never witnessed, and knowledge of anatomical procedures they had never been taught. Most disturbing, they began experiencing intense cravings for raw meat and found themselves drawn to isolated locations where they claimed to hear their father's voice providing guidance. The Brennan children established what they called a memorial society dedicated to preserving their father's spiritual teachings. They recruited other young people from families that had experienced mysterious deaths or disappearances, claiming they could help them understand their inherited trauma through special communion rituals. Within 3 years, the Memorial Society had grown to include over 30 members who practiced modified versions of Haven's Rest consumption ceremonies. Margaret Caldwell settled in a mining town in eastern Pennsylvania. She established a boarding house that attracted young, isolated workers with promises of spiritual guidance and communal living. Over 3 years, 14 boarders disappeared. When authorities finally investigated the property in 1869, they found a basement workshop containing human bones, arranged in religious configurations, and detailed anatomical drawings annotated with mystical symbols. Caldwell herself vanished before authorities could arrest her, but her influence continued through a network of contacts she had established throughout the region. Several other boarding houses and communal living arrangements in Pennsylvania and Ohio began reporting similar disappearances, suggesting that she had taught her methods to others before disappearing. Sarah Whitmore herself vanished from public records after 1863. Her journal ends abruptly with an entry dated March 15, 1861. Brother Thorne was right about the necessity of spreading our sacred knowledge. The awakened must establish new communities to preserve the truth. I have been chosen to carry the teachings westward. The transformation continues. But Whitmore's disappearance from official records doesn't mean she ceased her activities. Census records and local newspaper accounts from frontier communities in Kansas, Colorado, and California contain references to a mysterious woman matching her description who appeared in isolated settlements during times of crisis or hardship. She was described as a healer and spiritual advisor who offered assistance to struggling communities, particularly those facing food shortages or disease outbreaks. But perhaps the most disturbing evidence of Haven's Rest's continuing influence lies not in individual cases, but in institutional cover-ups. Government records show coordinated efforts to suppress information about the settlement and its survivors. Newspaper articles about related incidents were removed from archives. Death certificates were altered or destroyed. Witnesses were relocated or disappeared entirely. The pattern suggests something far more organized than individual survivors acting alone. It implies a network of believers working to protect and expand Thorne's teachings while maintaining absolute secrecy about their true nature. The sacred order of necessary consumption wasn't destroyed by the rescue. It adapted and evolved. Documents declassified in 1992 under the Freedom of Information Act reveal that the Department of War had established a classified research program called Project Enhanced Soldier in 1864. The program's stated goal was investigating methods for improving the physical and cognitive capabilities of military personnel through experimental dietary modifications. The program's methodology included controlled consumption of specialized organic compounds that were never specifically identified in the available documentation. Project Enhanced Soldier was supervised by Dr. Matthias Crane, a Harvard-trained physician who had previously worked with the Thorne family's private medical facility in Boston. Crane's personnel file indicates he had extensive knowledge of physiological consciousness enhancement techniques and had published classified research on nutritional pathways to cognitive evolution. His work continued until 1889, when the project was terminated, following what official records describe as uncontainable experimental complications. Modern researchers attempting to trace Haven's Rest connections have encountered systematic obstruction. Archives that should contain relevant documents report mysterious fires or water damage. Genealogical records for the families involved show suspicious gaps. Even academic researchers have faced harassment, threats, and professional sabotage when pursuing this topic too aggressively. Dr. Margaret Hensley, an anthropologist at Ohio State University, spent 15 years investigating cannibalistic religious movements in 19th century America. Her research repeatedly led her back to Haven's Rest and its survivors. In 1987, shortly before publishing her comprehensive findings, she disappeared during a research trip to the original settlement site. Her car was found abandoned on the old trail to Beacon Hill. Her research notes were never recovered. The few investigators who have visited the Haven's rest site report disturbing experiences. The settlement's buildings collapsed long ago, but the stone foundations remain visible. Local wildlife avoids the area entirely. No birds, deer, or even insects are found within a half-mile radius of the ruins. Visitors frequently report sudden temperature drops, disorienting spatial distortions, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. More troubling are the reports of fresh human remains discovered at the site. Park rangers and hikers have found bones that show signs of recent exposure to the elements, despite the settlement being abandoned for over 160 years. Forensic analysis of these remains reveals tool marks consistent with deliberate butchering and evidence of consumption. Someone is still using Haven's Rest for ritualistic cannibalism. The modern trail leads to urban legends and internet conspiracy theories, but also to documented incidents that authorities work to suppress. Emergency medical personnel in several states have reported patients with unusual physiological characteristics, enhanced muscle density, modified dental structure, and abnormal blood chemistry, who refuse medical treatment and cite religious exemptions. These individuals invariably disappear from hospitals before comprehensive examinations can be completed. Social media monitoring has identified coded communications between groups calling themselves awakened communities or sacred nutrition societies. Their discussions reference historical figures and locations connected to Haven's Rest. They share recipes for what they call transcendent proteins and discuss methods for identifying suitable candidates for spiritual nourishment. Law enforcement agencies have noted these communications but struggle to prove illegal activity based on cryptic religious language. You need to understand what this means for you personally. By learning this history, by connecting these patterns, you have become aware of something that certain groups prefer to keep hidden. Your knowledge makes you both valuable and dangerous to organizations that have spent 160 years protecting their secrets. The evidence suggests that Haven's Rest wasn't an isolated incident, but the founding moment of a persistent movement that continues to this day. Thorne's vision of evolutionary spirituality through human consumption has been preserved, adapted, and spread through generations of believers who view themselves as humanity's next evolutionary step. They operate through legitimate institutions, maintain generational wealth, and possess resources to silence threats to their secrecy. The survivors of Haven's Rest and their descendants have had 160 years to perfect their methods, establish their networks, and position themselves for a larger transformation of human society. The scattered incidents and disappearances may be preparation for something much more ambitious, a coordinated effort to introduce their practices on a massive scale during a period of social upheaval or collapse. Climate change, resource scarcity, and social inequality create conditions similar to those that originally drove people to isolated religious communities like Haven's Rest. Economic desperation, political polarization, and institutional distrust make populations vulnerable to charismatic leaders promising transcendent solutions to material problems. The modern world may be perfectly positioned for the emergence of Thorne's true vision. The sacred order of necessary consumption is real. They are active, and they consider you either a potential recruit or a necessary elimination. Your survival depends on understanding which category you represent and acting accordingly. The choice is yours, but the consequences of your decision will extend far beyond your individual fate. The future of human evolution may literally depend on how you respond to the truth about Haven's Rest and its continuing legacy. Winter is coming again. The question is whether you will be predator or prey when the snows begin to fall.